Hello, everybody. This is, believe it or not, the 17th episode of Scale Up Podcasts. This is really getting to be exciting, and we're building up a lot of knowledge here about how companies grow. And that's what Scale Up Podcasts is all about. This is Dan Eisenberg, and I'm really excited to have with me Leo Bonanni, who is the founder and CEO of a really exciting venture, Sourcemap. We'll, of course, talk the rest of the time just about Sourcemap, but let me say, in terms of disclosure, I'm a very happy direct and indirect investor in Sourcemap because Sourcemap was supported by E14, where I'm an LP, but also had the chance to participate in a sidecar investment. So I do have an interest, but hopefully this podcast will take place regardless of my interests. So Leo, welcome to Scale Up Podcasts.
Thanks for having me.
As you know, Scale Up Podcasts, we don't let anybody prepare anything. This is all spontaneous. So everything I ask Leo is going to be a surprise. So first of all, Leo, without saying anything about Sourcemap, who is Leo?
That's a good one. Well, I am a serial entrepreneur. I am an inventor, basically. So I came through a lot of different paths to get here. I was a musician. I was an architect. I was an engineer, and I landed in the world of supply chains and policy through all of that. And I'm very happy where I ended up.
Well, it's funny because it's absolutely not a straight path, right? So I hope we can tie this back into what Sourcemap is, but I want to put people out of their curiosity. What is Sourcemap, sort of the 60-second version? And in particular, what problem are you trying to solve? Not now, but when you started. And how has that evolved?
Yeah, look, so Sourcemap is what it's called. We are a supply chain mapping software company. So the problem we solve for customers is we work with very large multinationals. We help them find out exactly where all of their products come from. And we specialize in the nth tier, the raw material origins. And so for a lot of our customers, whether it's for tariffs or risk or sustainability or compliance, they need to find out who supplies them with the raw materials to make sure there's nobody doing anything wrong and that they're taking full advantage of everything they can to make their supply chains more efficient and more performant. And so they use our software to find out who supplies their suppliers. They build out a very extensive social network numbering in the tens and hundreds of thousands of suppliers to get down to the farms, the mines, the factories. And they use all that wealth of new data that they collect through Sourcemap to make their companies much, much more competitive.
So you said hundreds and even thousands of suppliers?
Hundreds of thousands of suppliers.
Hundreds of
The
thousands.
case of our biggest customers, yeah.
Okay, so if you can name some customers, name them or one or a couple of them as we sort of talk about this. How in the hell do you collect data of hundreds of thousands of suppliers of a large company? This sounds a little bit crazy.
Well, and that goes back to actually my thesis, right? My thesis at the MIT Media Lab, which I defended in 2011 in March, was, and I'll tell you why that date was important. But look, even back then, companies would say, "Hey, I don't know if there's a supplier halfway around the world that supplies someone who supplies someone who supplies me, and something goes wrong. It's just impossible for me to manage all of the potential suppliers I buy from, especially if I'm a big company." And I said, yeah, but even then we had social networking technology, graph databases, the real-time web that people were using to share pictures of their lunch with other people, millions of them around the world. And the supply chain is really just it's a large trade network, but it's a very small social network. And so if we use the same technology that's been developed for consumer social networking in the enterprise space, we would make it impossible for a company to say, I don't know, I can't find out. And instead, we would start to find ways that companies could actually use this additional visibility to their advantage.
So I want to come back to the pain point again. What was sort of like the key pain that you addressed initially? Was it a feel good? I want to make sure I'm not using children, or was it more of a business decision? I want to make sure that I'm getting the right materials. What was the initial pain point that you addressed?
It's funny. Most things happened at the same time, and that was the great thing about the fact that my research was on the one hand, it was sponsored by the Knight Foundation for journalism, and on the other hand, it was sponsored by large corporates that were also sponsors of the MIT Media Lab. And so I had Airbus as a sponsor of my PhD research, and I had activists at the same time, and basically this both happened. One, I was teaching industrial design to a bunch of grad students, and I wanted to give them tools to measure social environmental impact of what they were putting out in the world. And so mapping where all the materials come from is a very effective way to understand, should I make this out of aluminum or cobalt or recycled plastic. But on the other hand, and that's why the date of my thesis was kind of prescient. Right after I defended the tsunami hit Japan, one of our research sponsors was Procter and Gamble. They immediately came and said, "Look, we need your mapping technology. Despite the fact that you built it to crowdsource, environmental and social impact, but we need it today to find out if we have any suppliers in Japan that could have been impacted by the natural disaster, to see if there's anything we can do to make sure the supply chain doesn't break down." So right at the beginning, there was a social mission, and there was also a very clear operational reason for being.
We haven't even gotten to tariffs yet. We'll get that in a second. I'm sure they always were an issue, but they become a bigger issue, obviously, recently. But how do you collect so much information? It's just incredible, the numbers of data points that you must have. They must be in the billions.
They're in the billions for each customer. Look, the way that it works, and really this snowballed, but at the very beginning, it was a bunch of courageous enterprise customers that said, they thought they had the market leverage to make essentially a new kind of collaboration possible. The approach is they invite their suppliers to join Sourcemap. So they join Sourcemap like they would join any other enterprise supplier portal, like an SAP Ariba. They get in there. The first thing we do is we ask them, where's your company headquartered, but where are the actual facilities where you make stuff? Because that's where Sourcemap already broke new ground. We were the first to geolocate the where made. Right after the tsunami, companies had the billing addresses of their suppliers, but they, believe it or not, they did not have the actual street address of the factory. So finding out that the Hitachi factory was actually on the coast of Japan took companies 3 weeks at the time. So we said, okay, first, tell us where your facilities are. Second, tell us who supplies them. And again, not the billing addresses, but the actual facilities that supply you. And then immediately our software does what we call cascading, but essentially it invites those suppliers of the suppliers. Same thing, big multinational brand is mapping their supply chain for various reasons, provide us with the manufacturing locations and the supplier locations that you have. So we get to tier 2, tier 3. These days, the process has become so commonplace. Within the first 24 hours of a company signing up for Sourcemap, inviting their suppliers, they're discovering tier 4 suppliers. So that means suppliers of suppliers of suppliers. Yeah.
So how many companies altogether would you estimate that you have in this network? Not necessarily your customers, but also including all the suppliers to your customers. Must be a big number.
Yeah, right now, we added 1 million last quarter, so it's 6.5 million suppliers in our database, and only a couple hundred customers, brands that use our software.
So that's what you mean by cascading, all these tiers. It's like a geometrical progression. And I imagine
it is. Yeah.
It really is exponential. This is one of the real appropriate uses of the term exponential.
We just last week, one of the most let's say transparent companies about working with Sourcemap. I can name them: Ferrero, the large candy company. They announced that they reached 97% traceability for their cocoa and 90% across palm and hazelnuts, and that represents over 500,000 producers. So just that company has gotten down to about 500,000 suppliers.
I could easily imagine that as this develops, let's say you have 6 million or so suppliers, and that number will probably go on. At some point, you've covered all the suppliers in the world. Of course, that won't exactly happen, but these suppliers, are probably connected to each other in a lot of cases. Do you also discover that, and what are the implications of that for you and the value that you can add?
Yeah, there's a ton of synergies, and it's not infinite. I estimate there's probably only 100 million of these companies on Earth, and the number of farms, the number of mines, it can't grow infinitely, and sometimes it actually contracts. So we're getting to saturation with certain raw materials, especially the ones that are under regulatory scrutiny, some of the rare metals. What's interesting is the companies that have been doing this for more than, let's say, one cycle. What they're able to do is find the kind of synergies that a company would look for when they're doing M&A. So they're saying, oh, look, I've mapped tier two, I've mapped tier three. All of a sudden, I'm finding out that my suppliers are using lots of different sources for this metal or this fabric, and I can tighten that supply chain up. I can find a vendor that makes the best version of that. I can nominate that vendor to be the vendor to all my suppliers. And so what they're actually doing is, in many ways, controlling much more tightly the indirect supply chain that they never knew what it was before, and they're able to save money, but mostly secure supplies of the quality of products that they want. And so that visibility really gives them extra quality control. And then we have a couple of customers that have now negotiated contracts with tier two, tier three, and tier four suppliers of certain strategic materials, because they also want to make sure they're not running out whenever there's a squeeze on the market.
So you become incredibly strategic for supply chains, and it's not just in the narrow sense supply chain, but also in the broader sense of looking for efficiencies, simplifying supply chains, single sourcing responsibly, and so on and so forth, right? You become really strategic for these customers.
And the way that the cutting edge here is, there are a lot of industries springing up, especially in the renewables, the electric auto space, that in order to meet even their own projections for growth, are going to have to find completely new sources, stable sources of very large volumes of basically new materials that didn't used to be sourced at scale. And so for those companies to even break ground on a factory, they need to have a supply chain mapped down to the mine and secure those volumes of raw materials. And that's where the most strategic play, and not just at a company level, but whole industries and frankly governments need to start to map supply chains and make sure that who they're relying on for raw materials is going to be around.
So here roughly how many data points do you have? Would you estimate? Because then I want to know the question.
Look, a typical customer in Sourcemap has terabytes of supply chain data. And if you know supply chain data, most supply chains fit on a spreadsheet. So that's a lot of data. Keep in mind, we also collect all of the evidence, right? You can't take suppliers at face value. So when someone tells you who they buy from, we need to collect documents, transaction records, shipping, bills of lading, all of that to substantiate the supply chain. So
Okay.
with the network comes a lot of data.
Okay, so here's the question. I don't know if you remember 4 or 5 years ago when you were presenting at one of the E14 conferences, I was the guy who asked you, well, couldn't you become the Google of supply chain or manufacturing or even business for that matter? Now you're already 6% of all the companies, which on one hand could sound like a small number, but it's actually huge number, 6%. And tomorrow it's going to be 10%. This may be really a tough question, but I'm sure you've thought of it. It's power, information is power, right? And so you in some ways become more powerful than your customers, or potentially can become more powerful or as powerful as your customers. How does that dynamic play out? Who owns the information, how much you use it, and how is that affecting your present and future thinking?
I mean, our customers. So we live in a world where, on the one hand, the suppliers are very motivated to provide data because we have some of the biggest brands in Europe and North America using Sourcemap, requiring this data, and frankly, they're favoring suppliers that are more transparent about their supply chains. over the ones that are more opaque. So there's a great deal of incentive. So for suppliers, the data they put in is really a form of sales and marketing content, and they put it out there and they try to use Sourcemap to send data to as many customers and potential customers as possible. So that's really a wonderful source of rich and validated data. On the customer side, customers do you know, they pay us essentially to keep that data that they collect for themselves. They do not share that data. In some cases, we couldn't share it even under contract because it would constitute a trust, right? For some of the commodities on Earth, we know more about how much everybody pays than any of them do. So
Can you use the data? If you don't share it, can you use it?
no, we certainly can't beyond the permissions that our customers give us. So what they have given us permission to do and what they use it for is to detect fraud and patterns of any kind of waste or abuse. And that is something that industry groups have agreed to come together and say, well, let's at least look at the deviations, the anomalies, the people who are shipping too much from too small of a facility, the fluctuations in the seasonal volume. Say, I don't need to know how you figured out that there was a likelihood of fraud in my supply chain, but tell me that there is if you find it. And so we are able to use the data, anonymized, aggregated, and pattern match it against the trading patterns to find some. It's essentially the way that credit card companies look for fraudulent patterns of spending. Same thing here, but at a scale for companies that routinely spend billions of dollars on single materials.
So let's fast forward to the future, and I want to make sure we come back and talk about the numbers. But current tariff craziness, no matter how you look at it, there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of noise out there about tariffs. How's that impacting your business challenges and opportunities for Sourcemap?
It's we get this question a lot. So tariffs, for better or for worse, right now they operate more like just a disruption. So in the sense, like a tsunami. So you have a disruption, and then for weeks or months, companies are scrambling to figure out what the impact is and find alternatives. But then really nothing happens again for years. And so that is a very strange cycle. So every time there's a natural disaster that affects supply chains, we get called by a lot of companies that need to scramble to find out what the problem is. And then, they gradually subside. Every time the tariffs change, the same thing happens. What's interesting with tariffs, and what a lot of people may not realize, is that a lot of the new tariffs and regulations aren't just about who exported to the US or to Europe, but actually some of them now target the raw materials. And so there's a whole series of tariffs called Section 232 in the US for any product made with steel or aluminum. If it doesn't contain American steel or aluminum, there's an additional, right now it's 25% tariff. That's what helps those products.
Do they rely on Sourcemap to help them figure this out?
We learned it from our customers. They had apparently been doing it all along, which is to say, if they can show that there's any US cotton, US aluminum in a product, then that entire add-on tariff goes away. So that's a huge one, and Europe is following suit with it's essentially the same thing under a different name, the carbon border adjustment mechanism. Essentially, steel that may have been used in Germany, but if it was melted in China, it carries a different tariff than if it was melted in Germany, and so more and more going to the raw materials.
And I assume you can do this really fast and efficiently, so that we know tomorrow or the next day how we have to report on the tariffs, et cetera.
Right. I mean, certainly we learned in the process that this is all done by consultants and accountants, and it's all done by hand. And when you have Sourcemap, finding out where the steel was melted down is a byproduct of the process you're already running.
So now let's sort of talk about money and talk about Sourcemap from just a business point of view. Tell us the story of Sourcemap just by the numbers from a business, starting with how do you make money?
Absolutely. So it was no easy task, right? Because the company selling supply chain transparency, when I started in 2011, it was no small task. Not to mention that we rely on the cloud, and we wanted all the supply chain data to be in the cloud. Back then, that wasn't allowed. Most of it was on premise, and we're bringing essentially a lot of bad actors to light very quickly. So companies actually have to be ready I mean, we run all the suppliers we map through a watch list, that looks at all the global risk indicators, but there are about 70,000 companies in that watch list. And so one of them props up, and then they often change, anyways, they change name. So there's a lot there to unpack. So for the first, I would say, 9 years, I bootstrapped the company. I wasn't convinced that this was a mainstream product. We had customers like Mars, chocolate. We had, the very big CPGs that I mentioned, a lot of apparel companies, but it was a software for companies that wanted to go above and beyond, and they were trying to root out child labor or deforestation or one or another issue. Then we saw the rumblings of regulations that were going to require some of this accountability. Until 2020, companies really couldn't be brought to court because of something that happened in their supply chains. It had to be something that someone they had a contract with. When we saw those first regulations come, that's when I went out to market. Essentially, we were selling software, but a lot of consulting, and we were probably under $1 million revenue for that first bootstrap stretch. But we had a great time. We got to visit all the origins. We got to go to lots of cocoa farms. 2020 comes around, and one side of it was the pandemic, and obviously that was a huge supply chain disruption. So a lot of companies came to us at a time when they were not interested in sustainability, but they came to us to map supply chains to figure out if they could keep sourcing from where they were sourcing from. And then on the other hand, the U.S. Started to ban certain products that were associated with forced labor. Europe started to present laws that were going to ban certain products that were tied to deforestation. And so we saw a much larger market emerge. We were part of a lot of those conversations. We have conversations with the EU and on the Hill pretty regularly since 2020. And that's also when I got my first seed investment. And really, since then, we've grown about 10 times in business. So we'll be at the 10 million mark this year.
Got it. So how did you start? You sort of transitioned from consulting, which is a completely different business model, to a different business model. What is that business model? Is it a subscription? Is it something else? Is it by data point, by supplier number?
Yeah, this is where the investment really went. It was to turn it into a software as a service, to standardize it, to make sure that we can use the same code for an aerospace company, a car company, a candy company, a clothing company, and that's what we've achieved. So since then we've raised quite a bit, Series A and B, and we've used it to make this a standard SaaS software as a service. And then our customers pay a pretty reasonable annual subscription based on the workflows. And so if they're just doing it for US, they pay one price. If they're doing US and EU, but when they buy Sourcemap, they replace dozens of people trying to do this manually. In some cases, it would be impossible to do manually. And they are able to then comply with all the requirements on both sides of the Atlantic and get all the strategic benefits that I mentioned earlier.
So it's pretty simple for them to say, I want this kind of subscription.
The challenge has been this is a new business process. So some companies don't yet have a budget for it. And that's been the kind of the benefit of Sourcemap all along. We created a new form of enterprise software, supply chain mapping. We created, in many ways, we were part of the creation of a bunch of the reasons why people do it. And then now we're seeing very mature companies that are spending 7 figures annually on this, and companies that don't yet have a sourcing department with strategic purview that are just getting into it and doing it for basic compliance.
I don't know you personally at all. I've seen you at various conferences. We've said hello, et cetera. But you seem like a really unusual person, unusual background, music, et cetera. And it looks, just from my side, looks like you're having a lot of fun. But I'm sure it's also at times stressful. Um, tell us about the personal side of this. How's it been for you?
You know, uh, um, it's certainly everyone who works here, me included. We do it because we like solving interesting problems. We like having an impact, and we like making useful tools. So there's a pragmatism and a sort of a curiosity that everyone here shares. It's been a whirlwind to go from what was a consultative, largely sustainability company to a heavy engineering driven compliance company. I mean,
That's usually that's usually a very painful transition because the business model changes and cash flows change. In consulting, you get paid up front, you get paid when you deliver. Other kind of business, you have to invest a huge amount up front, and then you get paid a little bit, but lots of little bits later on, right?
yeah, and culture, right? I mean, it's being a compliance solution is a totally different type of delivery of products than being a sustainability solution or nice to have. So the more and more rigorous it's become, now we are. There are a few people here who spend their whole day on the phone with system integrators so that Sourcemap can connect to SAP, enterprise databases, and European, customs portals and American, U.S. Customs and Border Protection software. So there's a heavy integration, heavy security, heavy privacy, and so that you can imagine that it's we've had to bring on a whole new kind of team to meet the new demands.
How many people in working at Sourcemap?
There's only about 60 of us.
Which is given the amount of business you do, it's a very modest team size wise.
We've learned that yes, the more we can standardize, the more we can standardize both the software and the delivery of the software, the better we do. So actually, in a lot of ways, the path to profitability has made us also deliver a lot better products.
Is that a priority now, becoming profitable?
The market is moving under our feet for as you said, so tariffs appeared. They will also go away at some point as a matter of urgent concern. Europe has flipped the script on a number of the regulations that they were going to have. The US has introduced new ones. So as an effort, I would say more than profitability, diversification has been my priority for the last 2 years, making sure that we're not subject to any one set of laws or any one industry's preferences. So actually right now we are the most diversified ever. We're half in North America, half in Europe. I think our biggest industry that we are in is retail, and that's only about 30% of our total business. So we're staying diverse because again, it's a tough time for anybody who's banking on regulations to stay the way they are, and that's we're bouncing along with that.
So let me ask you this: as long as it's only you and me having this conversation and no one's listening, have I mean that facetiously, obviously. Have you made any mistakes along the way? The kind of mistakes that if you had to do it over again, you probably wouldn't make.
Oh boy. Yes, only, it feels like only mistakes, but but after making up mistakes, you get a good decision in there. Look, we bootstrapped for so long. I think the temptation was always to build what the customers wanted, and many times that led to solutions that now became the norm. I mean, when the first candy companies made the first commodity traders upload a map of all the farms in the forest where they source things, it was tough going. It became the norm. At the same time, we did it with a lot of companies, and it didn't become the norm. They probably didn't have our best interests in mind, and so we've learned to be very discerning about which are the companies that are partners and they want to grow with you, and which are the customers that will draw as much lifeblood as they can out of you before they discard you. So not being too consultative is a fight that we fight every day. Pushing for some global standards, that are higher than the norm. That's also been very important. Whenever we've tried to meet the world where it was at, it hasn't lasted long enough. And then staffing. I mean, you look at who works at Sourcemap, and it's become a SaaS company first and foremost, when it was almost entirely a sustainability consulting company 10 years ago.
Did you have to make some painful changes?
They're all painful, but we've been very resilient. I mean, the one thing that's great about having, we're the only company of this size that has a policy team that's on the hill. We have this insight from those 6+ million suppliers and the data they upload. So yeah, we're making changes all the time. I would say the speed of change is what's exhausting.
Oh, it's really phenomenal. We're going to end up here. Just one more question. If you met your younger self, let's say your 25-year-old self today, and your 25-year-old self wanted to build a company, what advice would you give him?
Honestly, I couldn't have seen it coming. I couldn't have picked a better way to spend the last 15 years. But it would have been impossible to relay it to me 15 years ago. But look, pursuing things I was passionate about, trying to change the world at scale, using the latest and greatest technology and the access that I had at MIT to all of these corporates that were really focusing on R&D and the art of the possible. I think those all led to a great way to spend my life, and certainly a great change that we've implemented across the world with all the companies we work with. So I wouldn't have done it any differently. I just could never have expected it. So if I tried to explain this to myself 15 years ago, I wouldn't have believed it.
Well, it sounds like one of the things might be if you want to look for opportunity, embed yourself where there's lots of opportunities sort of all around you. That sounds like one of the
That's
conclusions.
right. Now, listening to this, who would have thought that supply chains were going to be such an exciting space to be in? They
Exactly.
certainly weren't. They were not 15 years ago. Yeah.
It sounds like today, if you go to Silicon Valley, you'd say, if you want to put people to sleep and turn off investors in 60 seconds, you'd say supply chains. So
Yeah.
we're going to wrap up. This has been Leo Bonanni, who is the founder and CEO of an amazing venture. I'm really excited. And I have to say, I'm also blessed in being able to spend 30, 40 minutes with all these really interesting founders and such a variety. So Leo, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And just remember, everybody, this is Scale Up Podcasts. I do this for fun. It's a hobby. But if you like it, I'll like it. You know what I mean by that. Pass the word on. We're building up an incredible inventory here of extraordinary insights about how do you grow companies. Pretty soon, I'm going to be taking all these transcribing everything, throwing it all into Chat GPT and seeing what kind of insights we can get out of this. And I'll be sharing this with all of you. So again, to my listeners, growing listeners, now there's a few thousand out there. Thanks for listening. Send your comments, and thank you all very much. So again, Leo, thank you for being with us. This is Sourcemap, and take care.